going to get going here. We're coming up on 5 after. I did want to let everyone know that our next Faculty Fellow lecture is by Anna Kornblue in the new year. She will be on Thursday, February 4th at 4 p.m. on Zoom. And my name is Mark Canuel, for those of you who don't know. I'm director of the Institute for the Humanities, and it's fantastic to see everyone. This is our last Fellows of the year and the last official Institute event for the year, although there are other working group events happening. And so I would like to take an opportunity to thank our fellows for this year, our faculty fellows, also Linda Vavra, who has been so crucial for getting our programming online and continuing our academic conversation. I'd also like to extend my thanks to our graduate students who are not actually here in the audience, but very much in spirit. Tierney Powell and Dan Majors, they help us behind the scenes to keep everything running and keep everything advertised. And so we're so grateful for their labor and ingenuity throughout the year, really. And also, last but certainly not least, thanks to everyone in the audience for coming to participate in these online events. It's a difficult time. Everyone's stressed out, annoyed, and totally sick of Zoom. But or maybe I don't think I'm only speaking from my own perspective here, but I'm so grateful. We're all so grateful for the fact that people overcome these barriers and join us together in these intellectual conversations and real community that have been sustained online during really difficult times. So thanks to each and every person who is tuned in here today. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Susila Gurusami today. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice at UIC. She received her BA from the University of Michigan and her MA and PhD degrees from UCLA. Before joining us at UIC, she was a postdoctoral fellow at UC Riverside, and she also taught at the University of Toronto. Gurusami's work is situated at the intersections of race, class, and gender, and analyzes, in particular, the problem of women's incarceration and the phenomenon that she calls carceral migration, the forced movement of women in the US prison system. She also writes extensively on post-incarceration life and on matters of theory and methodology in order to gloss the complex racial and gender-inflected contours of capitalism that are relevant to all humanistic inquiry. I would cite in particular her groundbreaking article, Working for Redemption, Formerly Incarcerated Black Women and Punishment in the Labor Market, published in Gender and Society in 2017. And there she outlines a theory of intersectional capitalism that accounts for the subjugation of formerly incarcerated Black women according to the constraints of rehabilitative labor. And this is an article that's received a huge amount of attention and recognition. I encourage all of you to take a look at it if you haven't. She's received numerous awards and distinctions from the ASA for her work, and among the many honors she's received are the Arlene Kaplan Daniels Paper Award from the Society for the Study of Social Problems and the Cheryl Ann Miller Award from Sociologists for Women in Society. As part of Susila's talk today, we have a very special guest whose experience in life and work is closely connected to the content of Susila's presentation. Cheryl Ward is from California and was incarcerated in the Federal Bureau of Prisons for 17 years, 6 months, 13 days, and 1 hour from the time of her arrest in August of 1995. Since her release, Cheryl's many accomplishments And public contributions include graduating from Clyde Terry's Emerging Leaders Program, working as a community organizer for a New Way of Life Reentry Project, and serving as a board member of the Can Do Justice Through Clemency Foundation. She has spoken at numerous venues around Los Angeles, participates in Susan Burton's Testify, and serves as a volunteer for Clyde Terry's Emerging Leaders. So please join me in warmly welcoming Cheryl and Susila. And Susila will take the mic and start things off today to discuss her work, Extraordinary Rending, Carcerally Conditioning Black Motherhood.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. You'll all see my dog for a moment there. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here today and being the first to hear this excerpt from my book manuscript. I'd want to extend my gratitude to the UIC Institute for the Humanities for giving me the time and space to think through this work collectively with all of you, and especially to Mark, Linda, and to Danielle Smith for making the arrangements for today. And thank you to Tina Dillon for captioning this event. But I really owe the most gratitude to Ms. Cheryl Ward, who's joining us today as an honored guest and who's going to be speaking at the conclusion of my talk. Cheryl, thank you so much to you and your mother for inviting us to hear about your experience. Before I start today, a few things. So first, I use the term carceral, which is an umbrella term that refers to incarceration, the criminal legal system, and punishment related to the criminal legal system. And I also want to offer some brief content warnings. I'm going to be speaking at length about challenges with child custody, racism and sexism, dementia, incarceration, institutionalization, death, and racial chattel slavery. I'm going to start today with an ethnographic vignette with Mary, one of the women who I got to know through my field work that really changed how I understood the stakes of incarceration. She and I were sitting in the living room together of the reentry home where she was housed, and Mary had offered to watch another woman's baby while she napped, knowing that the baby had kept his mother up all night because he was teething. When I arrived, Mary was gently bouncing the baby on her lap, and he was cooing and giggling happily. After she and I had been chatting for a bit, the baby got a little fussy, and she briefly leaned her forehead against his, and I watched while he turned a sweet, nearly toothless smile towards her face. A string of drool escaped the corner of his mouth onto her blouse, and Mary mopped the spittle up with a grin and hugged him close, her hand coming to cup his head as she pressed her nose to his curls and inhaled deeply. Then she carried him into the kitchen to warm up a bottle, showering his perfectly round cheeks with noisy kisses along the way. While we were talking and playing with the baby, Mary told me, "I don't have kids no more. I'm not a mother, not anymore. My children were taken from me a long time ago. They wouldn't know me from a stranger on the street." A few weeks later, Mary and I were sitting together again, and this time both of us were searching on our laptops for possible apartments she might move into after leaving the reentry home. At one point, her fingers briefly stilled over the keyboard, and she abruptly turned back to our conversation about mothering. Without lifting her eyes from the screen before her, she said, "My kids were taken. They were adopted out when they were young, so now I take care of everybody else's. I've always been very motherly. I've always been very caring, and so it just seems like people tend to be they take to me." I want to linger on and with Mary's words and reflect together on the profound analysis she provides. I want you to put yourself in Mary's shoes for a moment. Imagine what it was like for her to tell me this while she was holding someone else's baby. This is a person who's deeply invested in gendered care work. She's really generous with her hugs, called everyone baby, and I've seen her comfort other women from the reentry home, rubbing their backs and holding them close while they cried into her shoulder more times than I could count. She exudes what many of us would recognize as a maternal energy. So much so that other women she was incarcerated with still call her Mama Mary, which is a fact that she proudly shared with me. Now, think about what it means for this woman to think of herself as not a mother, not anymore, to live with the reality that her own children were taken from her. Mary hones in on a transformative dimension of how she experienced carceral punishment. She's morphed into a stranger from her own children. She doesn't use the language of lost custody or family separation, the terms that academics, social workers, lawyers, and other professionals tend to use. Mary specifically uses the language of taken, implying that the removal of her children from her care amounts to theft. And where the state might use that language of family separation, lost custody, or other euphemisms, Mary's pointed, repeated use of taken evokes something that's more disturbing and visceral. And it's something that captures the material and emotional reality of hearts shattering, of mother and child being torn from one another, being forcibly moved to different places, and of children and motherhood being stolen and thieved. She reveals how incarceration and criminalization transformed her from mother to not a mother, not anymore. From mother to stranger on the street. From mother to motherly. And from mother to other. Mary experiences so many forms of theft in this carceral transformation. Her family is stolen. Her time with them is stolen. Her children's memories of her are stolen, and her possibility of making memories with them in the future. She also experiences a theft of her sense of self. She expresses that her identity as a mother is stolen from her, and she's only left to behave like a mother. Today, I'm going to take up Mary's analysis as our point of departure. The key questions I'm going to address today are: what does it mean for a Black mother to be made into a stranger to her children, especially given the global history and present of anti-Blackness? What does it mean to be unmade as a mother, and how does it happen in the context of carceral terror? To engage these questions and highlight an approach that Mary's analysis compels, I'm going to briefly take us through some of the scholarship on incarceration and families, highlighting what I believe to be some key differences in prison reform versus abolitionist orientations. Prison abolition scholarship often traces the origins of the prison and carceral logics back to racial-chattel slavery, identifying the long historical continuity of anti-Black enslavement logics into present practices of carceral captivity. Among these practices, what's often named as family separation in scholarship on incarceration, immigrant detention, and other forms of carceral enclosure remains a rallying cry for reformers who write and speak of family separation, collateral consequences, and secondary prisonization, to name the intergenerational pain and punishment that comes from incarceration. And my own published work uses this type of language. Such scholarship and activism rightly names that incarceration is a multi-generational, communal form of punishment that ensnares and entangles those beyond the person who's formally sentenced. But do these terms, family separation, collateral consequences, and other common academic and policy language about the family impact of incarceration actually capture what Mary revealed, that she was made into a stranger to her children when they were taken from her? There's something crucial lost when we name carceral impacts on the family as afterthoughts or in hierarchies of state violence, instead of evidence of how the state targets Black families through incarceration by design. I believe that we also reify anti-Blackness when the terms we use don't capture the affective, emotional reality of what it means to live through and survive children and mothers being taken from each other under the legal allowances of state captivity. I think we have a lot to learn about the family violence of incarceration if we merge Mary's analysis with Saidiya Hartman's work on the afterlife of slavery. In her book, Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route, Hartman writes, "The most universal definition of the slave is a stranger, torn from kind and community, exiled from one's country, dishonored and violated. The sale defines the position of the outsider. She is the perpetual outcast, the covered migrant, the foreigner, the shamefaced child in the lineage. Contrary to popular belief, Africans did not sell their brothers and sisters into slavery. They sold strangers, those outside the web of kin and clan relationships, non members of the polity, foreigners and barbarians at the outskirts of their country, and lawbreakers expelled from society." Building from the framing of the slave as stranger, Hartman writes of the afterlife of slavery to name how Black life and death in the present is shaped by racial chattel slavery. And in titling her book, Lose Your Mother, Hartman herself positions the loss and theft of the Black maternal as central to racial chattel slavery and its afterlife. She pushes us to think about how the loss and theft of the Black maternal is foundational to the violence of being made into a stranger and of being made into a slave. And in the afterlife of slavery, it pushes us to think about contemporary law and social structures and how they continue to cast the Black maternal as strange in order to make Black people into strangers to the national and global polity. This work of estranging Black mothers from their children is an extraordinary form of state making and world breaking. It's entirely ordinary, meaning it's a feature of everyday life, given how many Black children have an incarcerated parent, and that the state disproportionately severs the parental rights of Black mothers. It's also ordinary in that it's not new. Racial chattel slavery first normalized the tearing away of Black mothers from their children, and scholars like Dorothy Roberts, Sarah Haley, and Chinyere Opara document how this practice both required and provided long-standing scripts for casting Black child-maternal bonds as illegitimate, imaginary, and deviant. It is, however, extraordinary that we as a collective society have cultivated such animosity and indifference to Black families that we accept how regularly Black children are ripped away from their mothers. Whether through maternal incarceration, the foster care system, children's incarceration, or the police murders of Black people, the extraordinary lengths to which our legal system is leveraged to estrange Black mothers from their children and justify this estrangement as a form of public safety is perpetually on display in our everyday world. In other words, the state commits extraordinary violence against Black families in its ordinary system of governance, especially through carceral punishment. Mary compels us to consider how she, like so many other Black mothers whose children have been taken by child welfare services, incarceration, police brutality, or other state means, contends with the violence of this afterlife in her children being taken in the present, when she is made into a stranger from her children and made strange to herself by transforming from mother to motherly. In this afterlife of slavery, we have to understand what it does to Black mothers to be made into strangers from their children through incarceration. These are thefts for which there is no recovery. People don't just get better from losing their mothers or their children. They simply learn how to live differently. And sometimes they don't live at all because they don't survive that pain. But Black people have been subjected to this form of very legal violence for centuries. I would challenge us to think about these conditions not as family separation or a collateral consequence of incarceration. I would challenge us to develop terms that reflect these terms of very profound violence. To theorize possibilities, I draw on the legal concept of rendition, defined as the surrender by a state of a fugitive to another state, charging the fugitive with a crime. Extraordinary rendition, also known as secret or forcible rendition, is the militarized movement of a suspected criminal to another country, often a country known to violate human rights and due process of law. I use this framing because it captures how Black mothers and children are forcibly and spatially wrested from each other through the use of the law in a nation that's been at war with Black people and life since before it named itself a country. To highlight the visceral impact of this governance strategy, I revise extraordinary rendition to become extraordinary rending. I define extraordinary rending as the state's profound violation of the relationship between Blackers and their children through carcerologic practice and institutions meant to estranged Black mother, their children from each other and from themselves. To rend is to remove from place by violence, to wrest, to split or tear apart in peace by violence, to tear the hair or clothing as a sign of anger, grief, or despair, to lacerate mentally or emotionally, to pierce with sound, to divide something, such as a nation, into contesting factions. My home disciplines of sociology and criminology rarely name the impact of incarceration in these terms. My use of the word rending is in part meant to push back against the common, even if unintentional, practice of sanitizing violence through the naming and labeling of concepts. Extraordinary rending meant to capture the trauma meaning making that comes of taking Black children and their mothers from each other in multiple overlapping and intersecting registers. What Mary experienced, having her children taken from her and becoming strangers to them, and her sense of self being so transformed that she is alienated from the identity of mother, this is a rending. And it is an extraordinary violence to have the identity of mother taken from her, wrested away, her children removed from their place with her family split and torn apart. To divide a family through the carceral, to tear away Black children from their mothers, this is extraordinary rending as the afterlife of slavery. I argue that the state uses extraordinary rending to normalize anti-Blackness as governance with two relational aims. First, to condition Black families into accepting punishment institutions as a normal feature of everyday life by carcerally attacking Black motherhood through A, socializing Black family members into being alienated from each other, and B, socializing Black mothers and daughters to being alienated from themselves. And second, to condition non-Black people into accepting this form of violence as a neutral and acceptable form of legal power. Yet, even though the state takes children away from so many Black mothers, women like Mary continue to do mothering labor in the aftermath and find and create joy and love in the process. Like the legal practice of rendition, extraordinary rending positions Black mothers as perpetually deviant and running from the law. In other words, they are made into fugitives. But during both racial chattel slavery and in its afterlife, Black mothers find spaces, places, and ways to be free, to be mothers and to parent their children and other people's children, and to build home places. They resist being turned into strangers from their children and themselves, and these are acts of fugitivity born from generations of Black maternal resistance. And that Black children continue to love their mothers and honor Black mothering, even after being taken, speaks to the power of this resistance. Given this, I contend that extraordinary rending as a form of statecraft also reveals how Black mothering is always a fugitive practice. To come to the concept of extraordinary rending, I draw on 18 months of participant observations in the early 2010s with formerly incarcerated women in Los Angeles. I began by recruiting participants from an organization that I pseudonymously call New Beginnings, an LA-based organization that provides housing, case management, and rehab services for formerly incarcerated, often Black women and their children. Most of the women who I followed were residents of New Beginnings or people who I met through the organization. As an unpaid social work intern, I drove formerly incarcerated women to medical appointments, attended court hearings as an advocate, and helped with job applications. I also spent time with women in their homes, met with them over meals, took walks with them in their neighborhoods, and had long conversations by phone, text, and email. I supplemented this ethnographic data with photo-elicited interviews with 12 key informants, all of whom self-identified as Black, African American, or part Black. And in this method, participants take photos to provide visual representations of their experiences, then explained the importance of these photos to their life narratives. As a non-Black cisgender woman, someone who hasn't been incarcerated or had anyone in my immediate family incarcerated, and who's never lived in South or South Central LA, there's likely a lot that I missed because of my status as an outsider, and not everyone at New Beginnings was eager to share their lives with me. And I say this to preempt that a lot of what I observed is likely a diluted perspective on the challenges that formerly incarcerated Black women face. I can talk more about my positionality and why photo-elicited interviews were so critical to my methods in the Q&A, but for now I'm going to move on to the findings. I found that many women had stories of extraordinary rending, like Mary's, of Black mothers becoming strangers to their children because they were incarcerated when their children were minors. Most who were legally permitted to were trying to get to know their children again, even if they weren't legally allowed to live together. And many of those who couldn't be reunited with their children established roles as other mothers, like Mary did. I write about this in the book chapter, which you'll be able to read once the book is finished and published. However, in what follows today, I'm going to talk about another register of extraordinary rending. The way extraordinary rending violates Black motherhood through incarcerating adult daughters. To do this, I'm going to be introducing you all to my friend Cheryl, who has been kind enough to join us today and will be speaking with us directly later on. Cheryl has a passion for sharing her experience as a formerly incarcerated person and caretaker, so she's foregone the use of a pseudonym so you can hear from her directly. I've included some recordings from our time together so you can hear her analysis in her own voice. And she's also provided photos that she wanted me to use today for this presentation that are important to her. Like Mary, I met Cheryl while I was doing ethnographic fieldwork. And like Mary, Cheryl had her children taken from her when she was incarcerated. But in the time remaining to me today, I'll be focusing on Cheryl's experience as a daughter, since incarceration also took her away from her mother. Most of the scholarship and public discussion about incarceration and Black mothers focuses on how minor children are impacted when their mothers are incarcerated, or on how mothers cope when their sons are behind bars. But Cheryl's experience highlights how the state also uses the carceral to violate the relationships between Black mothers and their adult daughters by making them strangers to each other through the nets of aging, disability, and their care work. I'll talk about how Cheryl and her mother experienced extraordinary rending across many critical junctures following her release from prison, and how Cheryl's persistence and love for her mother is a call to action for abolishing carcerality in all of its forms. I'll begin with the theft of memory. To understand more about her life and experience, Cheryl invited me to go with her to visit her mother at the state-run rehabilitation clinic where she was housed, just a short drive away from where Cheryl lived in her Trump home. A guest check-in notice was posted at the front, but Cheryl ushered me past it and strode down the hallway. We made our way to her mother's shared room, and Cheryl called out greeting to staff being down the corridors. The mingling scent of disinfectant and urine permeated Cheryl's mother's shared room. Her mother, Ms. Annabella, was wearing a white nightgown, and a slightly deflated balloon waved gently next to her bed. Greeting cards rested on the bedside table. Cheryl pulled up a chair beside her mother's bed, kissed her on the cheek, and said, "Hello, Mother. Do you know who I am?" Her mother responded with a glare and said, "I know who you are," then curled her hand into a fist. Cheryl looked at me and chuckled and said, "She has no idea." She turned back to her mother and said, "Mother, it's me, your daughter, Cheryl." This short exchange between Cheryl and Ms. Annabella captures how part of the punishment of incarceration is an attack on the right to remember and to be remembered. Ms. Annabella was nearly 90 years old when Cheryl was released, and by the time I met the two of them, dementia had claimed most of Ms. Annabella's past and future memories of her daughter and of herself. Extraordinary rending functions to make the most familiar features of life and self strange. It takes connections that we often understand in terms of the natural and biological, like the relationship between mothers and daughters, into something unfamiliar, unknown, and strange. Incarceration made Cheryl into a stranger to her mother after nearly 2 decades in prison, even though Ms. Annabella was not a stranger to her. There's an undeniable feeling of strangeness and pain that comes from the symmetry of remembering someone you love, of having a lifetime of memories with them, but knowing that they can't remember you and what you meant or still mean to each other. And that is part of the punishment of incarceration. Racial chattel slavery provides foundational logics for this practice of incarceration and its impact. The right to maternal love is often naturalized as an essential, universal condition of humanity, to remember our mothers and to be remembered and loved by them. So, an attack on that maternal memory under racial chattel slavery specifically targeted the bonds between mothers and their children and their memories of each other, to undermine the right for enslaved people to understand themselves as human and to be understood by non enslaved people as human. In the present afterlife of slavery, incarceration continues this attack on maternal memory. The prospect of being unmade as someone's mother or daughter because one is no longer remembered is not simply an unintended consequence of incarceration. It's a reflection of how anti-Blackness is built into the fundamental structure of carceral punishment. The perspective or actual loss of collective memories because of a relative who's either too young, too old, or too sick to remember their incarcerated loved one doesn't compel the state to release someone from prison or jail, not to incarcerate them in this place. Carceral punishment is leveraged as a family punishment, in which the building of future collective memories are denied and past memories are made vulnerable to loss. People on both sides of the wall are left to wonder how much those they love will have been irrevocably changed by their time apart. Preliminary research on dementia finds that chronic stress may be linked to progressive cognitive impairment. And having an incarcerated child, even one who is an adult, is an unquestionably stressful event to endure for nearly 20 years, as Ms. Annabella was told to. And when we contextualize this further within multiple generations of cumulative stress and forced separation that's been pushed upon Black people and condensed into shared experience in predominantly Black neighborhoods, this attack on memory facilitated by incarceration is revealed as a form of structural anti-Black violence. Many scholars who write about incarceration detail how mothers of young people cope with their carceral confinement, or how the children of incarcerated parents are traumatized as system-impacted youth. However, Cheryl's experience highlights how the normalized violence of incarceration obscures how adult incarcerated women, like those in their 40s and older, also suffer because they're parted from parents they love. Extraordinary Rending doesn't only steal time and memories from parents and children who want to experience the milestones of childhood and adolescence. It also weaponizes time and memories from parents and children who are racing the clock against the forces of aging. But time isn't the only thing that carceral violence violates for Black mothers and their children. It, like racial chattel slavery, is a multi-generational attack on the right to dignity. I witnessed this through Cheryl's analysis of her mother's captivity in the rehabilitation clinic, and in how Cheryl had to fight for Ms. Annabella's right to live in humane conditions. At the nursing home, I watched as Cheryl took her mother's hands in her own and gently turned them back and forth. Cheryl noted that Ms. Annabella's hands and nails were crusted with food and dirt, sighed, and told me how the staff didn't clean the residence well. She got a washcloth and tenderly wiped her mother's face and fingers, despite Ms. Annabella's feeble attempts to bat Cheryl's hands away. Cheryl asked me to sit with her mother and talk to her while she found a staff member to change Ms. Annabella's diaper, and I nodded and stood next to Ms. Annabella, told her my name, how I met Cheryl, and tried to relay how kind and generous her daughter had been to me in the short time that we'd known each other. Ms. Annabella gave me the same stern stare she directed at her daughter, but said nothing. Cheryl returned with an orderly, and we stepped out of the room so Ms. Annabella could be tended to with some privacy. In the hallway, Cheryl told me in low tones that even though the place looked clean, the residents with dementia were left to sit in their urine from 4 p.m. until the next day. She told me that she worried about what her mother endured while she was in prison, especially before she could be there to tell nursing home staff to take care of her. She persistently raised how she believed the clinic wasn't the right place for Ms. Annabella, saying,
To me, she doesn't need to be there because she's not like the other people. A lot of them are like comatose and their legs are cut off or something, and she just wears diapers, can't walk, and doesn't know who she is. She knows who she is, but she just, her mind is going away. And I said that this.
Cheryl went on to say,
I said that this is like being in prison. You just stuck in the same place. They take them out their rooms and put them in the day room, and they put them back in their rooms. So I push her to the front when I go, so she can see cars and stuff. She likes. She said, "Ooh, look at that." We like.
Cheryl names how her mother's institutionalization, because of disability, race, and class, noting for me at one point that the facility was a public one that served poor people of color, coalesced to produce an experience similar to her own incarceration. Her analysis is sharpened by her lived experience. She commonly references the time she spent in federal custody, 17 years, 6 months, 13 days, and 1 hour, as a measure of how her time locked up shapes her understanding of the world around her. In her analysis, Cheryl names the nursing facility as a carceral one. In the afterlife of slavery, anti-Blackness manifests as the state naturalizing Black life as unclean, as a way of denying dignity to people who are institutionalized, whether in prisons or nursing homes. A key feature of carceral punishment is forcing people to live in squalor. Other women at New Beginnings described the daily torture of prison and jail as being forced to use dirty bathroom facilities, not being allowed to shower as a form of punishment, and being stuck in their cells with overflowing toilets 23 hours a day for weeks and sometimes months at a time. By forcing people to smell, look, and feel dirty, and seem strange and different to how they are known to those they love on the outside and to themselves, this denial of dignity constructs people who are institutionalized as other and strange. It's a multisensory attack on dignity, both in self-perception and external perception. To resist her mother's transformation into a stranger through extraordinary rending, Cheryl refuses dementia as a reason for Ms. Annabella's confinement, using her own experience with incarceration to recognize being stuck in the same place and soiled clothing as forms of institutionalized suffering and punishment. Cheryl told me many times how her mother was a fastidiously clean woman who took great care with her belongings and self. In advocating for her mother's cleanliness as dignity, she advocates for Ms. Annabella's right to recognize parts of herself and her humanity. In this construction, Cheryl refuses ableist understandings of the self that would construct people with dementia as too strange and too much of a stranger to themselves to feel dirty. She refuses her mother being made into someone unclean, someone that would be a stranger to Cheryl and someone that would be a stranger to herself, by restoring her mother to a state of cleanliness that Ms. Annabella would want for herself. In Decarcerating Disability, Liat Ben-Moshe develops the term raceability to capture how prevailing logics about both disability and racism intertwine to inform carceral logics and practices. The state's practice of warehousing so-called racialized surplus populations couples with disability to reflect how carceral locales produce profound suffering and humiliation for their targets. These carceral locales often employ claims around care work, justifying confinement and the indignities that accompany it, by raising that people who are institutionalized in prisons and nursing homes require physical, emotional, or psychological assistance in their daily lives. But Cheryl rejects that captivity serves as care work for her mother and disrupts the application of raceability logics to Ms. Annabella by creating a different version of care work, one that involves valuing her mother's right to dignity as cleanliness and movement. Cheryl fights back against her mother's carceral confinement by fighting for her dignity as freedom. She advocated daily to make sure her mother wasn't sitting in her own waste overnight, and physically cleans her mother and shifts her space beyond the walls of the nursing home to give Ms. Annabella glimpses of freedom. The final vector of extraordinary rending I'm going to explore today are carceral attacks on Black maternal intimacies. Because Ms. Annabella was deemed by the state and healthcare providers to be incapable of caring for herself, her care decisions were designated to a legal conservator. One of Cheryl's sisters was designated as Ms. Annabella's conservator while Cheryl was incarcerated, and this sister placed Ms. Annabella in the care of the rehabilitation clinic for daily living and care. When Cheryl was released, she wanted to liberate her mother from the nursing facility and bring her home, especially because she witnessed firsthand that the standard of Ms. Annabella's care was far below what she could provide for herself. She planned to bring Ms. Annabella back into the house where their family had been living since the early 70s and care for her at home. Cheryl trained in and administered hospice care for other women while she was incarcerated, so she was both skilled and practiced at this type of work. However, this possibility was forestalled by key carceral conditions. First, Cheryl's criminal record prevented her from being designated as a legal co-conservator after her release from prison. And second, Cheryl's sister wouldn't provide legal permission to bring their mother back to live in the house. Cheryl told me, "The house has been empty since they put her in the rehabilitation clinic. My friend said to me this morning, 'Is your mama sitting on some kind of landmine of money that only your sister knows about? She doesn't want to take care of my mother. She just wants to take care of my mother's money.'" She went on to say,
I said, I was with my mother from the time I was born till I was 36 years old. My sisters didn't grow up with my mother like that. They left one when she was 16, 17, and the other one left, I think, when she was 18. So, and then my two nephews were raised here. Yeah, both of them were raised here. And my son was raised here, so it's our home. And people they don't really buy homes for your kids to sell. They buy homes so your kids will always have somewhere to live and stuff. And I'm not going to let them get away with that. Just like she should have been living in her house and not living down at that place.
in Ms. Annabella's case, the state's legal narrative constructed Cheryl as a stranger to her mother because she was incarcerated for nearly 20 years. The consequence of this narrative is that Ms. Annabella is confined in a carceral institution, and the state makes Cheryl's carceral history a barrier to bringing her mother home. These conditions reveal how the afterlife of slavery tries to steal the intimacy between Cheryl and Ms. Annabella. Under the conditions of enslavement, the state and slaveholders constructed relationships between Black mothers and their children as lacking true intimacy and love. This framing allowed them to justify separating mothers and their children through sale, but it also allowed them to control Black mothers and their children through the threat of sale and through prohibiting contact with each other. This cruel attack on mother-child intimacy was upheld by the law, which dictated that slave owners could determine the legal terms of contact and cohabitation between Black mothers and their children. However, Cheryl resists the logics of extraordinary rending that aim to legally transform her into a stranger from her mother, and instead calls upon the history of her relationship with her mother in their home to establish that their intimacy transcends the state's narrative. She establishes a fugitive counter-narrative to the anti-Black carceral one by refusing that her incarceration constituted an absence and erasure of intimacy between her and her mother. Instead, her sisters are transformed into strangers by their choice to leave. And she argues that the intimacy that she and her mother shared through 36 years of cohabitation can't be dismissed just because she was incarcerated. Cheryl establishes further intimacy between herself and her mother by emphasizing that their connection extends into the next generation, by highlighting how her mother cared for her children in their shared home while Cheryl was incarcerated. She positions this multi-generational intimacy and shared lived space as oppositional to the racial colonial aims of the law, ownership over people and property as prospective profit. Cheryl unsettles the conditions of extraordinary rending in her analysis, even as she and her mother remained subjected to its violence. The motivation behind my talk today isn't just an intellectual project. It's a deeply personal one. I wanted to share with all of you what Cheryl has been generous enough to share with me over the years. I've never been so profoundly struck by someone's love for their mother as I've been by Cheryl's. Witnessing the tenderness that she extended to Miss Annabella, even as Ms. Annabella's memory and health continued to deteriorate, was a rare and precious gift that I feel so honored to have witnessed. Once Cheryl finally found the legal means to care for her mother at home, Cheryl and Ms. Annabella were rarely parted. Cheryl even documented their adventures together on Instagram through an account dedicated to Ms. Annabella. And it's a visual testament of their shared love, intimacy, and joy together. As Ms. Annabella's health continued to decline, Cheryl provided updates about her mother's weight loss and progression towards a skeletal condition, her difficulty sleeping, and the obvious pain that Ms. Annabella suffered. But Cheryl's steadfast dedication to her mother and her efforts to help Ms. Annabella enjoy whatever she could, whether it was going to church or holding on to Dean, the dementia care baby that was often nestled in Ms. Annabella's arms, is an extraordinary testament to what Cheryl refused to allow extraordinary Rending to rob her and her mother of. Before we move on to the conclusion, I'd like us to take a moment to honor Ms. Annabella. She transitioned in January of this year, and Cheryl is still very much healing from her loss. Ms. Annabella's 97th birthday would have been a couple of weeks ago, so please feel free to pass on any wishes of kindness, gratitude, love, and healing to Cheryl directly or through the chat box function in Zoom. The state's carceral, anti-Black foundations try to make the love that Cheryl shared with her mother illegible, unknowable, strange, and impossible. Extraordinary Rending uses the law to try to steal love and its possibilities away from Black mothers and their children. I often hear scholars draw broad stroke analyses about the experiences of incarcerated mothers and their children and highlight the universal condition of suffering under carceral control to try to motivate change. But what I want to emphasize here is that there is an exceptionality to Black suffering under carceral control in the afterlife of slavery, especially as it profoundly violates the relationship between Black mothers and their children. That exceptionalism comes from the meaning of a collective experience that's been forced upon Black communities, families, and people for generations, even 150 years after the formal abolition of slavery. The experiences of Black mothers and their children under the governance of extraordinary Rending demonstrates the state's investment in carcerality as an anti-Black form of rule. Extraordinary Rending illustrates how the relationship between Black mothers and their children are extraordinarily violated through the law in everyday moments. The ways Black maternal relationships are disfigured, disrupted, and made strange through carceral logics and practices are part of a process of the state carcerally conditioning Black families and communities to accept these logics. And this happens under extraordinarily difficult stakes. Many of the women at New Beginnings whose custody of their children had been taken by the state no longer knew where their children were and expected that there was no way they could ever find them. One woman even found herself incarcerated with her own daughter, who's now serving a life sentence. And she raised how she'd been around and not cycling in and out of prison or jail. Maybe her daughter would have had a future outside of it. Given the critical role of Black women in sustaining Black communities and families, the work of extraordinary Rending as an attack on the Black maternal signals the state's perverse recognition of the symbolic and material work that Black women do in their everyday lives to create freedom, and that these freedom practices extend to undermine the collective pathological conditions of white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, racial capitalism, and other structural ills. The Combahee River Collective famously penned the words, "If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression." The power of the Black maternal, even and especially as it's cultivated as a fugitive practice, would mean the undoing of the carceral because it would undo the very practices of domination and subordination that make it possible. Mary, Cheryl, and Ms. Annabella highlight for me that it's not enough to reform a system built on Black suffering. We're called upon to abolish it in all its forms, because otherwise the system will continue to do what it's meant to: seek out ways to legally violate Black life and call it justice. Mary, Cheryl, Ms. Annabella, and all of the women whose experiences are condensed into this work demonstrate what it means to work towards feminist abolition. They find creative ways to advocate for unbounded love and connection, to name what the law has done to them and to their families, and to show us that there is another way. These are also women who often reflect on difficult relationships with their mothers and their children, and who don't romanticize the work of maintaining their relationships with the Black maternal as mother, child, or both. But they take extraordinary rending and refuse it, and they find creative and ingenious ways to show us the possibilities of freedom and liberation. So now I'll be putting a link to a rudimentary list of references and related readings in the chat box, but I'm going to hand off now to Cheryl Ward, going to be kicking off for today with 3 minutes on thoughts, questions, and suggestions. My deepest thanks to Cheryl for being so generous with her time, expertise, and experiences. Cheryl, I'll mute myself now, and I'll ask you to take your mic off mute so we can hear from you directly. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you so much. My profound thank you to Susila, Mr. Kanye, and the UIC people, and all of you here. And thank you so much for the messages that you're sending that I wish I could stop from coming because I don't want to read them right now. But I really appreciate you. But I just wanted to say that when we're incarcerated, and I want to say this to everybody, just because a person makes a bad choice in life doesn't make them a bad person. And you might know somebody that's incarcerated, and there are reasons people do things to feed their children, to make money, to make a place for them to live and everything, and they just make bad choices because it's a immediate need in their life, and out of desperation people do things that send them to incarceration. But I wanted to say also that when you're there with a lengthy sentence, we pray because it's our mothers who have our children, and we always pray nothing happens to our mothers, because if something would happen to our mothers, what would happen to our children? And those are they're the ones who love our children like we love them. And it is, they go to foster care, they get taken away when they really need to be with family and things. And my mother, she took care of me, and I have such fond memories of her holding my hand when she walked me to kindergarten, and wherever we went, she'd always be holding my hand, and that's what I always hold on to in life about her. For me, she raised my son, which my son is a good boy, and he's a man. He's not a boy. He's a good boy, a good guy. He's 29 now. He's never been in trouble. He's in his 3rd semester of Japanese because he wants to go teach English, English to over in Japan. And with COVID, I don't know how that's going to work because he said he doesn't want to do it on Zoom. But my thing, I thought with laws changing and things that one day I'd get out of prison and I'd be able to have more children. And that never happened because I got out when I was 58 and I'm beyond that childbearing age. But what happened is my mother became my child. My mother was my baby, and I used to tell her all the time, Annabelle, you took care of me, now I'm taking care of you. You changed my diaper, I'm changing yours. I feed you. And that relationship just, she was my child, just my child, just my child. And the little I could do to make the rest of her life comfortable, with her not knowing who I was, because somebody one day said to me, does your mother know you? And I said, no, but every day I go in the room, she smiles and probably says, here comes that lady that takes care of me. And that was just, it was just my honor for me to do something for her. And I used to tell people, and I still tell people, you cherish your children, cherish your mother, cherish your relationships, If you haven't spoke to your mother, I always tell them that, call your mother, tell her you love her, and don't wait to the last moment when her breath is going from her body and you're crying, but tell her and make life substantial for her, that she did a good job, because she does the best job she can with each of they do the best job they can with each of us. So okay, and thank you guys, thank you so much, because these things are still coming up on the screen and I appreciate this so much. Do I?
Thank you. I was just going to say thank you so much, Cheryl. I think many of us uh, in the course of our lives have the chance to meet people who change it forever. And Cheryl is one of those people for me. There hasn't been a day since the day I met her that I haven't thought about her and her mother. And I am just so thankful to her that she wanted to share all of this with you. She's always told me that she wants to be able to talk to people and share her experience. And to do that, especially in this space, is brave and is generous. And I, there just aren't enough words for my gratitude. So thank you.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, Susila. It's been a fantastic presentation from both of you, and we all appreciate this opportunity so much. I'd like to open up our chat for questions to both Cheryl and Susila. And you can just put a question in chat, or if you would like, you can just say, I have a question, and we'll shift the mic to you. So I thought I could start things out with a question, and it's one that's kind of a broad one to Susila and or Cheryl, and that is if you could comment on the various ways that people think about family in ways that are not only biological, but in terms of chosen families, and how those networks of closely knit people inside the prison and outside, and in the life after incarceration, how do those networks get altered, and how I guess this may be a little bit more pitched towards Susila, but how does this argument inflect the kind of work that happens in queer studies and queer theory that are a little bit less invested in the biological family and more invested in larger ways of thinking, or other ways of thinking about interaction and support networks?
Cheryl, I'll just answer quickly because I think you actually have I want to actually lead people to something that you said to me. So one of the things that Cheryl and a lot of other folks shared with me was, when people are incarcerated, and especially for a long time, you build other types of family networks. You build other networks of support that also are sustained once people are released. And Cheryl has told me about some really beautiful relationships and friendships that supported her when she was released. She told me about a friend who sent her a printer, who set her up with a cell phone when she was released, and helped bridge that gap. So I think one of the things that people often shared was that their biological families had, they weren't as present as, they would have expected. And so, relying on these alternative kin networks that were formed while people were locked up and through organizations that advocate for incarcerated people and formerly incarcerated people and provide these other other networks of other people who have similar experiences, that came to be not just an emotional source of support but also a material source of support that's life saving and critical. And Cheryl does so much of this work now too. So I'm going to hand it off to her because I think she can answer this more beautifully than I
can. Okay, can you hear me? I don't know how to.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so
you're loud and clear.
What actually happens there is I explain it like this. We spend more time than you ever spend with your family. Your family goes to work, goes to school. We're with one another 24 hours a day. So when we exit the incarceration and come home, and the other people come home and they're with their families, it's a family that has grown apart from you because they've advanced. We stop where we go into prison. And for example, when I came home, my son was 4. When I came home when he was 21, first thing I did was try to clean his ears. And he's like, "Hey, what are you doing?" Because I said to him, I realized he's still 4 as far as I'm concerned. So at holidays, you will get inboxes. We'll inbox one another on Thanksgiving, Christmas. I wish we could see one another because those are the times that we were close, but on holidays we had to stick together because we were without our family. And so that family in there was just a means for getting through, right?
Thank you for that. I will remind people, feel free to ask questions in the chat or just let us know if you have a question.
I know it's also the end of the semester and it's been a lot of Zoom, and that this is a lot to ask of everyone, but listening is also, I think, I really appreciate everyone joining, especially on December 1st at this point in the semester and the year and the pandemic. So thank you.
I see Laura with a hand raised there. You'll have to unmute, Laura.
It takes us a while to learn these things. Susila, thank you so much. I would love to ask you to reflect out loud a little bit on your use of language. You're clearly very attuned to it, both in, in the argument and the presentation, just like other, how you play with words, but also you have a real awareness that there's certain kinds of words or terms that, because they appear objective, like the emotion just turns off. Carceral consequences. Like, what the hell is that? Like, let's use language. So I would just love to hear you talk a little bit about the importance of language and your awareness of that in regards to this project.
Thanks so much, Laura. This is something that has taken me a lot of time to come to, and I think that this is part of a reflection of the professionalization in the academy in general. scholars are told to develop these terms that, will get used and reused. We're encouraged to like sort of do this like marketing about like the capital value of our terms. And I think also sociology and criminology being like really emerging from an anti-Black context, and sociology's own history come in the US is founded on a defense of slavery. So I think we can't let that history go. That history is still part of the discipline. And one of the things that happens in this push to reuse language and to reuse terms is that they're ones that are friendly to academics that also don't sound quite as violent as what they are. Because I think if we can name the terms through what white supremacy has done to people, things like, for me, one of the terms that comes to mind is something like prisonization. What does it mean to take the person out of a socialization process into, carceral ideologies? What does it mean to try to tell people, just come up with a term that people will use and reuse? I think there's actually a real importance to saying like extraordinary rending. It's not neatly packaged for someone to just like put into another paper. It's not something that I think lends itself to reuse quite in the way that, many of us experience our training. But I think that actually compels a pause, a stop to think about like, what is this? What's actually happening here? What's happening to people? My training as a sociologist, I think oftentimes took the people and the humanity out of the very conditions of violence that I was told to name and think about. And that's oftentimes because we're told to package things and to present it neatly, and people don't want to walk away with bad feelings from a presentation, especially when a problem feels really unwieldy. And I think that also speaks to the historical white investment in the field. So for me, part of what I am trying to do with this book and with, this process and thinking together with folks like Cheryl is actually paying attention to the words. People use what does it mean to have your child taken? That like family separation, it implies that it's something that just like organically happens, or it's just like a process. It doesn't even locate the actor in there or anyone who is experiencing it. It doesn't speak to the how and the why and like what does it do to the core of someone's personhood. So for me, part of what I am trying to do is to really speak to that, the core of personhood and humanity. And Leslie Abrego has a working paper that she uploaded recently on methodology and accompaniment as method, and reflecting on scholars who say the best part of the writing or of being an academic is the writing when you can distance yourself from the pain. And my sort of response to that would be, if you're distancing yourself from the pain, you're also distancing yourself from the people who have trusted you with their stories, who are asking you or who are trusting you to curate them with care. So for me, part of what I am trying to do, which I think is a very, very small step, is to engage in that naming practice, and to really be intentional about that. I'm not going to always do it well or perfectly, but I think that's also why it's so important to be in community with folks, to not disappear either. When you are done with the so-called research, the whole academy needs a rethinking, and for me, this is part of that process. So I guess that's my long form answer.
Thank you. Yeah.
We have a couple of questions that have come up. Beata, we do have time just to hand the mic to people. So Beata, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, thank you so much, Susila and Cheryl, for this. Was really a great experience. This is just a short question. I mean, are there any programs within prisons where you can keep your kids in the US, or is that a general condition?
Lynn Haney writes about this and Jill McCorkle in their books as well, there are some programs that allow mothers to have either sustained contact with their kids or have their kids live with them. LA had proposed, as part of its new like county jail program, they proposed building, like, I think they called it a family village or a women's village, where they plan to incarcerate women along with their children and present this as like a more gentle form of punishment. But I think one of the key things to take away from that is oftentimes these things that are presented as like, this is a better way to punish women or a kinder way or like more gentler way. And, you know, shout out to Ash and Beth and Alana if they're here. We're like building this concept of gentle justice in a paper to talk about how like these things are actually not gentle at all. If they're meant to, like, these just become another way to justify investing more money into prisons and into punishment and not into saying those mothers shouldn't be in prison at all with or without their kids. They should be at home. So there are programs that try to do this and that, like, you know, reemerge with some, it often happens under gender responsive sort of punishment is what it's called, or gender responsive programming. But, you know, I think the thing that's responsive to is like, how do we build up this carceral system to be better instead of how do we just like cut this thing off at the root? So I know it was a short question and I turned it into a longer one.
I loved it. I'm just wondering, sorry, because I think in Germany the prisons functions in a completely different way, I guess, right? Of course, I agree. You know, the question would be, why do we have these prisons? But yeah, it's yeah. Thanks for your longer answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people will point to European models as examples of like gentler prisons, like, oh, people who are incarcerated have cell phones and they, you know, aren't so dehumanized. But I think one of the things that incarcerated people have pointed out there is that those things are also still violent. There's still like this idea of separating people, of pushing them towards the stigmatizing experience. If we think less about how to punish people and more about how does everyone actually cause harm and pain and what would it look like to reorder this system of disorder through learning to live together collectively differently and confronting these like larger structural systems of harm, it places the question, I think, of gentler prisons, regardless of their global context, in a different light. But no doubt the US is one of the worst.
We have a question from Lori Gallo, which is a question that I'm kind of interested in too. Maybe both of you could say something about this. What was it like to be questioned and studied? Did you have to educate Susila, Cheryl, during this process?
Cheryl, I'll let you go ahead and answer that one.
It's not, well, I guess in a sense it is educating because we understand, like, probably all of you are never going to go to prison. So our experience that have come from out of incarceration is one that when we share it, people, they want to know a lot of stuff. And they'll say, "Oh, can I ask you questions?" But her questions were asked in caring way, because that's what I said to her, and I said to people who worked at the organization that I worked at that were never incarcerated, thank you for caring enough about us to ask us about what we went through. Because years ago, people were of the attitude that if you're there, you must be there for a reason and you probably deserve to be there. But we had a lady one time that came and she wasn't there long, like 3 months. And when she came to church the Sunday before she was released that week and said, I used to always think that people that went to prison deserved to be in prison. She said, but me coming here, I see that not everybody needs to be here. And that's the thing. There's a lot of people that really shouldn't be incarcerated. If there were alternate things, let them go home. threaten them and say, if you ever get into trouble again, you're going to go back for 25 years. They'll never come back. But it's a harrowing experience for people. And the separation is like so hard on some people.
Thank you for that.
I would also follow up. Cheryl is, as you all may have noticed, unusually generous and kind in her reflections and in how she engages people. I do think Cheryl did a lot of educating for me. I do think, my intention was always to be present and to not cause harm. But I think by virtue of, ethnography being a colonial method, of, the history of my disciplines, of where the academy is. And, I was a graduate student at UCLA, and where UCLA is positioned to South LA. There's so much that I think I didn't do well. I think people like Cheryl were incredibly kind and generous and, gave me space to, ask questions when everything about the setup said that, shouldn't have happened or wasn't fair. So I do think, Cheryl did a lot of educating me. I think I've had a lot of years to also think back about what I would do very differently. But in general, I would give all of the credit to the women who shared their stories with me, their lives with me, who really, I don't think that I did anything particularly well. I think I reflect on those things and can bring a different, feminist sort of lens to it. But yeah, Cheryl did a lot of educating. She continues to do a lot of educating, I think, and that work to be in community with folks is something that is ongoing. And Cheryl makes a lot of that effort. She's the one who so she calls me Princess. She texts me and then she'll call me Dr. Princess. And these are things that I think the affection and the kindness and sort of really giving her that credit for seeing an emotional possibility, and having grace and latitude, that was all her. And that was all the folks at the site. It definitely was, I think ethnography and the way graduate students are trained and, scholars are told to do this work is inherently violent. And it's the folks on the other side of the process that do the work to make it less so.
Thank you, both of you. Jeff Sklansky, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for incredibly moving and powerful presentation. And you've been talking about the way the prison system targets Black mothers and their children. And I'm wondering if Susila, your research, and Cheryl, your experiences, what they tell you or what they could tell us about how the prison system targets other people and other relationships, since Black mothers and their children are targeted in a system that's not only for them.
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, it's who is impacted beyond Black mothers and their children, essentially? Is that?
And you're telling us about how the prison system, as an afterlife of slavery, continues a work of rending Black mothers from their children. So I'm wondering how understanding the prison system that way can help us understand the prison system as it encompasses other people as well. You know, the Black mothers are incarcerated in a system not only designed for them and not only designed for that particular relationship. So what it seems like a lot of what you've been speaking to has to do with personhood and human dignity and themes that have a particular force for what you call the Black maternal, but that extend beyond it. So that's what I was asking, wondering about.
You know, I think so. This chapter specifically is focusing. I actually, to preface all of this, when I started this work, I said I wasn't going to look for things related to motherhood because all of the things that were written about incarcerated women centered motherhood. And so I had this sense of, what else is going on? What are the other relationships that are being violated? What are the other conditions? But time and time again, after I come back to the work, I find like motherhood is the thing that comes up first and foremost because it is something that like impacts people's sense of self so deeply. But I think, romantic relationships, other sorts of familial relationships, friendships, they're also profoundly violated by these conditions. And I think, the understanding that the prison in its current formation is emergent from this afterlife of slavery, the possibilities of the types of relationships that it can disrupt, that it can violate, that it can try to fundamentally alter, it's any type of human connection. But I think understanding that as emergent from anti-Blackness and from this specific type of gender racialized assault, part of what prison is, part of the punishment of prison, for instance, is sexual assault. It is designed to be a sexually assaulting institution. It is designed to alter and to disfigure people's relationships with their bodies, with their understanding of freedom of interiority, of the way that they'll relate to anyone in their lives. And I think the system being designed as an anti-Black one, simply because there are other people who are also caught in the net of that, the underpinnings of that being an anti-Black system doesn't mean that others are not impacted. But I think understanding how anti-Blackness functions at the core to justify these logics that then impact other relationships and other ways of being, it's impossible for the prison to exist as this punishing, thoroughly dehumanizing set of institutions without anti-Blackness, without the figure of, like, for instance, the Black rapist, of, the concept of deviant Blackness that allowed for all of these things to exist and to, like, for these punishment logics to arise. I think that historical grounding also it creates a different meaning for what this does to Black people. So even though others are caught within the net, I think it is really important to center anti-Blackness as foundational to that process and to those sets of conditions. So yeah, I would say that, the prison isn't good for anybody. For all of us, like Cheryl said, many of us who are on the screen will have never been to prison and will likely never go to prison. But simply because it exists in the way that it does, that fundamentally eats away at our collective humanity by simply imagining the possibility that there are people who should be there and who can be there and who get warehoused in that space. So I would say that through that anti-Black foundation, it assaults like nearly every type of humanity that can exist, particularly because of the afterlife of slavery. So that would be like I think I'm not sure if that gets quite at what you were asking. And I'm not sure if Cheryl has other thoughts on this as well.
Okay, so my understanding, because I am not intellectually, I was 3/4 away from a BA when I went to jail, And I was gone so long, some of my classes don't even count anymore. But my understanding of what he was asking, I can answer like this. My coworker Ingrid stopped at the store to get something. One of the children was asleep, so she took the other two in with her. When she came out, the police were there, and she went to prison, and her kids went to foster care, and she had to fight to get them back. As opposed to Orange County, there was a woman who left her kids in the car, and all they did was help find her children, and nothing happened to her. And I don't know if that's what you were asking, but it kind of, for me, that's what I was thinking you might want to hear.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, that's really helpful. We have a couple more questions where we can run a little bit over. Amanda Upgar has a question about trans folks in prison. Amanda, if you are available, would you like to join us and ask the question?
Hi, sure. Hi, Susila. Wonderful, wonderful work. I am so excited to assign your book to my students. My question is, if in your research, if you worked with or interviewed any trans mothers, and if so, what sort of like additional questions or analyses might have come out of that? And if not, if there were, I didn't add this in the chat, but was thinking of it later, if there were like very specific obstacles you encountered to like working with trans mothers, and just curious about that. And thank you again. It was awesome. And thank you so much, Cheryl, for sharing your story and your beautiful relationship with your mother.
Thanks, Amanda. Nice to hear from you. So I did not encounter any people who told me that they were trans. And so, in the context, like in the 18 months that I was there, so no one who I interviewed told me they were trans. But I will say, women who were in committed relationships with other women, and who had minor children did talk about how they concealed those relationships from social workers and from their children because they were worried about that impacting their child custody. They were worried about like judges and social workers and state agents using that as a reason that they, didn't have a stable family relationship. And like this was actually like a fairly regular topic of conversation, like, okay, so what do I introduce this person as like mommy's special friend? What if my kid accidentally tells something to the social worker in a way that would justify, like claiming basically that I'm not in this like nuclear family, and this seemed to be the most salient for women who had minor kids and who had like upcoming custody cases. For women who were older and who were in relationships with other women, from what they told me and from what I saw, those were relationships that were very celebrated by especially adult daughters, and folks who, were excited to welcome home, their moms and partners who they met while they were behind bars. So there's, I think, definitely, the absence of trans mothers from my own interviews and from, my field work. I think also, it may reflect who applies to the organization for reentry assistance. That may have changed since I was there, but the landscape of like queerness, of how people talked about queerness and how safe they felt around it also shifted with particular moments. Like one parole officer, one woman who wanted to live with her partner, her parole officer told her, like, I can't have you living with another woman. You two have to be in different reentry homes. Like, I don't want any funny business. There was, a lot of policing that happened also around the possibility of queer relationships from parole and probation officers, from what I could tell. And so for women, women told me I can't wait to get off of parole or probation so no one's up in my business. And so that policing, while it still happened around heteronormative relationships, it seemed to be that queer women were especially sensitized to the possibility it could be leveraged for punishment.
We have time for one more question, and Yesenia Vargas has a question here about the applicability of rendering to other models and or other institutional models. Yesenia, did you want to chime in here?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Susila and Cheryl, for this amazing talk. As you said, Mark, I just wanted to kind of think about how we can extrapolate these theories of the afterlife of slavery and extraordinary rendering to think about other, I guess, violent and punitive institutions. And I'm thinking specifically about the medical institution and how we can use this to understand, Black maternal mortality rates and infant death rates, as well as the high rates of birth trauma that Black women experience, and what this tells us about how other institutions also condition Black motherhood and dehumanize, and look at it on a systemic level.
Thanks, Yesenia. I think what you are pointing to is, so many of these institutions that exist in our everyday world are carceral ones, especially as they look to enclose and confine Black life. Damien Sojourner and Savannah Shand talk about how this happens in education institutions, K through 12, how, and we know higher ed reproduces so many of these carceral logics. And of course, the medical institution is a carceral one as well. Whether we think about how doctors have to report things to legal agents, how, the police often work in concert with doctors, how, forms of carceral policing and surveillance, for instance, like looking for the drug abusing Black mother. Medical institutions and obstetrics and gynecology have been formative to developing and informing those stereotypes, and casting Black mothers and Black women as drug seeking. We just Dorothy Roberts' work, I think, exemplifies this so well. How medical actors and how medical institutions have used the law to violate Black women's reproductive possibilities and reproductive lives. So I think, understanding, if we take the stakes as like, what does this do to create heartache and, take Black mothers and their children away from each other? Certainly infant mortality rates and birth outcomes are an enormous part of that. And the ways that, other like everyday actors are empowered to become carceral actors, to take on these carceral ideologies, to try to police Black life and look for Black deviance in all of these different ways. And, how non-Black people are regularly deputized to enforce that with life-altering and death-creating consequences. We can see that from schools to hospitals to, playgrounds, right? Just the ways that not just white actors, but all non-Black actors are empowered to police Black life in those ways. I think, it reveals a lot about how deeply embedded these things are. The possibility that like any of us can do this work to Black people who are not Black. And I think thinking about it within the specificity of like child maternal outcomes or maternity outcomes really puts a lot of concreteness around like what the stakes are, and that they're not just happening in prisons, and they're not just happening in spaces that are they're not just happening in supposedly punitive spaces. Any space can be turned into a punitive one under the logics of white supremacy and anti-Blackness.
Well, I'd like to once again thank both Susila and Cheryl. This has been such a wonderful example of a really imaginative, collaborative approach to research and scholarship. And so thank you both so much for this presentation, and also to our audience. I look forward to seeing everyone at another Institute event coming up. And meanwhile, best of luck with the end of the semester. Those of you who are doing papers and projects, and those of you who are on the other side, winding things up with teaching, and also stay safe and have a very restful break and happy holidays.
Mark, can I say one last thing before everyone departs?
Please do.
All right, if I can just ask everyone to get off mute and to give Cheryl a hand and thank her, I would really love to show appreciation and have her hear it. So if you're able to, if you're in a space, please take yourself off mute. Thank you so much, Cheryl.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Woo!
Thank you, Susila.
Thank you, Cheryl.
All right, everybody. Thank you.